Welcome to Woo Studio. Today, we're diving deep into a conflict we've all seen in the headlines for years and years, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're going to be looking specifically at Gaza, using Al Jazeera's live updates from January 3, 2025. It's easy to get lost in the day-to-day news, but we're going to cut through all that and really try and understand what's going on for the people who are actually caught in the middle of this.
Yeah, it's a very complicated situation, a long history, but I think if we focus on this one specific day, we can get some really important insights into how things work now and the terrible human cost of this conflict.
Exactly. And one thing that really jumps out from these reports is just how much suffering there is. Gaza's health ministry reports 45,658 Palestinians dead and over 108,000 wounded. And that's just since October 7, 2023. Those
Mm.
numbers are just, it's hard to even grasp.
It really is. And it's important to remember that these are not just numbers. Every single one is a life lost, a family destroyed, and a community that's changed forever. And like you said, these numbers are probably even higher because it's so hard to keep track of casualties in the middle of a war.
That's something that really hit me as I was reading these updates. It's not just about the people who die right away. It's the long-term damage to healthcare infrastructure to the whole society in Gaza.
Exactly. We see this in the reports of attacks on hospitals. The UN has documented over 136 Israeli attacks on 27 different healthcare centers in Gaza. Just imagine what that does to a healthcare system that's already struggling, the doctors and nurses trying to help people, and what it does to people who are constantly living in fear.
It's like ripples spreading out.
Hmm.
The violence goes way beyond the immediate targets. And speaking of targets, one thing that really stood out was the evacuation of the Indonesian hospital in Jabalia. Imagine being a patient, maybe a woman about to give birth or a child who needs help right away and being told to leave in the middle of an attack.
It's a terrifying example of how this conflict hurts the most vulnerable people. And what's really worrying is that there isn't clear proof to back up Israel's claims that these hospitals are being used by armed groups. The UN is concerned about this, and they're saying there needs to be independent investigations to find out what's really going on.
Because we have to hold everyone accountable, right? It can't just be one side's word against the other.
Exactly. Accountability is key, not just to figure out the truth, but also to build trust. And that's so important if we ever want to have peace.
Well, speaking of peace, there's a little bit of hope in all of this. These reports mention high-level people going to Doha to talk about a ceasefire with Hamas. Does that mean there's a chance for a real breakthrough?
It's good that they're talking,
Well,
but as always with this conflict, we have to be careful. The Malaysian Foreign Ministry has accused Prime Minister Netanyahu of using what they call obstructionist tactics, which could make it really hard to reach a lasting agreement.
Okay, so what exactly are these obstructionist tactics? What's Netanyahu doing that's causing concern?
Well, one big thing is that he's saying Israel won't agree to a ceasefire unless Hamas releases the Israelis they're holding captive. The U.S. agrees with him, but a lot of people see this as a big roadblock. They're worried that Netanyahu might be using this to stall or even stop the talks completely.
And all of this is happening while the U.S. is going through a big political change with Trump about to become president. Could that be part of Netanyahu's plan?
It's possible. Samuel Alarian, who's a well-known political analyst, has said that Netanyahu might be trying to use this time of change to get what he wants before the new U.S. president takes over.
So what we're seeing is that the politics inside both Israel and the U.S. are tied up with this conflict. It's like a really high-stakes game, and real people's lives are on the line.
Exactly. And if we want to understand why this conflict has been so hard to solve, we have to understand these political complications. It's not just about land or different beliefs. It's about political power, both within these countries and between them.
And it's about millions of people who are caught in the middle of this fight for power and control. We've been talking about Gaza, but things are getting worse in the West Bank, too. This adds another whole layer of complexity to an already very tense situation.
You're right. Sadly, things are escalating there, too. There are reports of clashes between Israeli forces and Palestinians who are protesting against Israeli settlements being built in the West Bank.
And that's a whole other side of this conflict that we need to look at. But before we do, let's take a moment to think about what we've learned so far about Gaza on this day in 2025.
It's like a frozen moment in time, a glimpse into the human suffering, the political games, and the fragile hope for peace that still exists in this region. One of the really disturbing things about this whole conflict is how it plays out in the media. Just like we've seen in other conflicts, truth gets lost. Everyone has their own story, their own reasons for the violence.
Yeah, that's so true. And here it's really hard to figure out what's real, especially when it comes to civilians being targeted. We were talking about the attacks on hospitals in Gaza. It's interesting how this shows just how hard it is to figure out Who's responsible in the middle of a war when information is being used as a weapon?
Exactly. And you see this in the UN human rights chief calling for an independent investigation. It's not just about finding out if Hamas was using hospitals for military purposes, but also looking closely at Israel's side of the story and the proof they've given for what they did.
So it's about making sure everyone is held to the same standard, no matter which side they're on. That's why these independent investigations are so important, right? Because they can help us see what really happened.
That's the idea. But even with the best intentions, these investigations are often limited. You have to deal with politics, people not wanting to share information, and the simple fact that it's hard to get evidence in a war zone.
It just shows that finding truth and justice isn't easy, especially in a situation as messy as this one. But even if we can't always get the whole picture, it's still important to keep asking those tough questions, to keep pushing for transparency and accountability.
Absolutely. Without that commitment to the truth, it's too easy for the violence to just keep going, fueled by lies, mistrust, and the feeling that no one will be held responsible.
Okay, so we've talked about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the hope for a ceasefire, and how difficult it is to figure out who's to blame for what. But what about the bigger picture? We mentioned that things are getting worse in the West Bank, too. Can you help us understand why?
Well, a big factor is that Israel keeps building settlements in the West Bank. Palestinians see this as breaking international law and a big obstacle to peace. These settlements often lead to conflict with Palestinian communities, and sometimes that boils over into violence.
There was that awful report about a settler attack near Silwad where 7 people were hurt, vehicles were burned, and olive trees were destroyed. It's just another example of how the cycle of violence continues. Each attack just creates more anger and resentment.
Exactly. And these incidents show how deep the distrust is between Israelis and Palestinians. It's not just about land or resources. It's about fundamental questions of security, identity, and belonging.
And it's troubling that even within the Palestinian community, there are divisions that make things even more complicated. The Palestinian Authority's actions in Jenin, including the alleged killing of a father and son, have been condemned by Hamas. It feels like every step forward is followed by 2 steps back.
It reminds us that this conflict isn't just one thing. There are so many layers, different groups fighting for power, and a huge range of opinions on how to achieve peace.
We've talked about the international efforts to get a ceasefire. But beyond that, how is the rest of the world reacting to this conflict? Is everyone on the same page, or are we seeing the same divisions and disagreements that have been around for decades?
It's a mixed bag, really. It reflects how complicated global politics are and how divided the world is. Some countries like Germany have called for an immediate ceasefire and criticized Israel for not doing enough to protect civilians.
But then you have others like Malaysia who are much more critical. They're even accusing Israel of genocide. It
Yeah.
seems like there's no agreement on how to deal with this, not even on something as basic as condemning the violence.
That's true. And without unity, it's much harder to put pressure on the people involved. Some say the international community needs to do more, like imposing sanctions or even military intervention. Others believe that any solution has to come from the people in the region through talking and negotiating.
So it's a debate that goes back to the core of the conflict. Who gets to decide the future of this land? And how do you balance the need for security, self-determination, and justice?
These are questions that have haunted this region for generations, and they are questions that we need to keep thinking about, even if the answers are hard to find.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. The terrible things happening in Gaza, the struggle for a ceasefire, the challenges of figuring out the truth, the rising tensions in the West Bank, and the world's struggle to find common ground. It's a lot to take in, and I think it's important to step back and think about what it all means.
You're right. It's easy to get lost in the day-to-day events, the political games, the accusations and justifications. We can't forget that at the center of all this are real people, families who have lost loved ones, children who have only known war.
It's their stories, their experiences that need to guide us as we try to understand and find a better way forward.
I completely agree. Peace isn't just about signing papers or drawing lines on a map. It's about creating a future where everyone, Israelis and Palestinians, can live with dignity, security, and hope.
You know, going through these Al Jazeera updates from January 3rd, 2025, it really hits you how deep this conflict runs. It's like we're seeing just one frame of a movie that's been playing for generations.
Yeah, it does feel that way. And it can be so overwhelming trying to figure out where to even start to change things. You've got decades of hatred, political obstacles, and this endless cycle of violence. So the question is, what can we actually do? What can anyone do when it seems like nothing can change?
That's the question that keeps coming back to me. What can people do? What can countries do? What can anyone do to bring lasting peace to a place that has seen so much conflict?
It's the right question to ask. And I think we have to start by shifting our focus from just managing the conflict to actually building a just and lasting peace. That means going beyond the crisis of the moment and tackling the root causes the fundamental issues of security, identity, and belonging that we talked about.
So instead of just reacting to every explosion, we need to be proactive in dealing with the underlying problems. But what does that look like? How do we actually do that?
One important thing is creating spaces for dialogue and making sure everyone has a seat at the table. Not just politicians, but people from all parts of society, community leaders, activists, regular people. We need to create environments where Israelis and Palestinians can hear each other's stories and experiences, build some empathy and understanding.
That makes sense.
Hmm.
But with all the mistrust and anger, how do you even get people to sit down and talk? It seems like any conversation would just turn into accusations and blame.
It won't be easy. There will always be people who resist change, who hold on to the past. But we can't let them silence the people who want something different. There are people and organizations on both sides working hard to build bridges, to promote understanding, to create a culture of peace. We need to support them, give them a platform to connect and work together.
So it's about changing the story from one of division and fighting to one of shared humanity and a common future. But that can't happen on its own. What role does the rest of the world play in this?
The international community is crucial, not just through diplomacy, but by supporting those organizations, investing in peace-building projects, and holding everyone accountable. This means more than just words. It means taking concrete action to address the root causes, like the occupation, the settlements, and the fact that there's no real Palestinian state.
So what you're saying is we need a fundamental change in how we think about this conflict, moving away from the old ways of power and politics, and towards a more people-centered approach that puts dialogue, understanding, and justice first.
Exactly. And it might sound idealistic, but I think it's the only way to have any real hope for lasting peace. We need to remember that this conflict didn't just happen. It's the result of choices that people made, and it can be changed by choices that people make.
So if we want a different future for this region, we have to start by changing how we think about it. We have to move beyond us versus them
Yeah.
and recognize that we're all connected as human beings.
And we have to realize that this isn't someone else's problem. What happens in the Middle East affects us all, and we all have a responsibility to work toward a just and lasting solution.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive into Gaza on that day in January 2025, I think we should all think about what part we can play in this. We might not be able to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by ourselves, but we can choose to stay informed, stay engaged, and stay committed to peace.
Absolutely. We can challenge our own biases, learn more about this complex issue, support organizations working for peace, and demand that our leaders promote policies that encourage dialogue, understanding, and justice.
This deep dive has taken us into a conflict that can feel overwhelming. But it's also reminded us that even in the darkest times, there's always hope. And that hope starts with each of us recognizing that we have the power to make a difference and choosing to be part of the solution.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's made you curious and inspired you to learn more. Because the more we understand, the more we can do to create a better future for everyone.
Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep working towards a world where peace wins.